Welcome to Business Line's State of the Economy podcast, where you'll find insight, analysis, and the story behind the numbers.
Hey there, welcome to the BL State of the Economy podcast. I am Shrivats from Business Line, and today we have a very interesting topic at hand, which is bridging the Indian startup governance gaps. India's startup ecosystem has experienced exponential growth over the past decade, emerging as the third largest globally. India today has over 100 unicorns among the over 1 lakh registered startups in the country. This burgeoning sector, while promising, confronts numerous challenges, particularly in the realm of governance. There have been several high-profile governance lapses that caught the attention of the global investing community, leading to sharp fall in valuations of few mature startups and even compelled the government and policymakers to rethink the governance structures and standards in the country. To get a deep dive on the governance issues around startups, Business Line spoke to Nikhil Bedi, partner and leader, Forensic Financial Advisory at Deloitte India. Bedi, who has over 20 years of experience in fraud investigations, FCPA diligence, business intelligence and transaction diligence, has advised large private equity clients in the region on pre and post investment and operational risk mitigation strategies from a reputational perspective. So, hi, Mr. Nikhil. Thank you so much for joining us and agreeing to discuss a very interesting topic on the state of governance in Indian startups. First question that I have is Indian startup ecosystem has seen a fantastic growth journey in the recent years. But somehow governance has been the weakest link in the success story of Indian startups. So, if you could update our listeners as to what is the state of play on governance among Indian startups and how has it been in the recent years?
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Shrivats, and to the Business Line team for having me. So yes, Indian startup ecosystem is flourishing, right? It is India is the third largest, startup ecosystem. They have over 110 unicorns, and there's so much investment here, over 350 billion is what is estimated. So yes, it's a good time to be in the Indian startup ecosystem. Having said that, as you rightly pointed out, there has been, and COVID has been a big accelerator, which has accelerated investments given a huge requirement of technology during that time when people weren't allowed to kind of mingle and go out, right? But yes, as you rightly pointed out, there have been certain, there have been certain issues, there have been certain stories which have come out, and that puts a bit of a question mark on what is the overall corporate governance play in startups. Now, I think from my perspective, you cannot paint everyone with the same brush. Corporate governance is something which is very, very fundamental to company building as a whole, and corporate governance really is. It serves as a beacon for all stakeholders on the health, ethical standards, and the brand perception of a company. Now, corporate governance is not it's a collective responsibility. It's a shared responsibility, not only of the founders, promoters, but also of investors, the board, and the entire ecosystem, right? I think there's not been enough focus, given that, there is scarce resources with startups. There is a lot of pressure on growth. Right. So also founders, they are technocrats, right? So they've never really probably they're not educated, experienced, or they don't know what are the requirements of companies as they grow and mature. So I think all this is very important, and you'll have startups at different stages, like the early stages, and as they grow, they evolve, mature, and so on, and they become ready for IPO stage companies. So at various points, there are different requirements of corporate governance for startups. So right now, I think, given some of the issues in the ecosystem, I think all stakeholders have taken note, the government, and there is a lot of focus on ensuring that startups are compliant. And obviously, you have to have a trade-off. You cannot put all your resources into corporate governance, right? Because ultimately, you have to have a product which is monetizable. So I think there is a balance that is getting created. Some of these issues have highlighted the urgent need of focus on corporate governance, but at the present moment, I think there is a balance, and there are a lot of learnings which have been taken. And I think all stakeholders, founders, boards, investors are remediating those requirements and are looking forward to the next phase of growth.
So, would it be fair to say that there is progress on the governance front? And do you still see it as a culture issue, or do you see this as the nature of the beast, which is startups prioritizing valuations and going after monetization rather than governance?
Right. So I'll just break up that question in my response. So I think, has there been progress? The answer is yes. There has been progress, right? So we, in our experience, have seen a lot of remedial actions being taken. Investors are focusing a lot more in diligence, even on follow-on rounds, on not only on the financial aspects, but they are looking at other areas such as governance, board constitution. Is there enough independent directors? Focus on CSR, ESG. So and they're trying to make sure that there is periodic intervention, which ensure that the companies or the startups are complying, right? So I think there even founders are getting more conscious, because ultimately corporate governance equals value. It's a very clear thing. A company with good corporate governance will attract more investors. It will attract, in an IPO, it will attract more retail participation, FII participation, and ultimately it will be better valued. So I think there is a concerted effort to remediate. Now, is enough being done? I think, again, I think it's very, very critical to see, on what stage a company is. I think there's a lot more education which needs to be done. Companies, we came up with a study along with IVCA and IICA last year, which was a prescriptive study on depending on the stage of where the startup is, right, they can try and imbibe certain corporate governance practices, keeping in mind the risk-reward ratio, because ultimately, if you don't have a product which is marketable, corporate governance, it may not be relevant if the company is not going to be successful. So if that balance is struck, I think a lot more is being done to try and ensure and imbibe. Ultimately, you cannot, there are certain situations where there is misappropriation, where founders have, done certain things. I think those, you need to have a lot of more monitoring, a lot of more proactive monitoring to prevent those. And, if you have a strong corporate governance framework, I think it helps to mitigate that.
But given the growth journey and the nascency involved, is there a case to show primacy to governance rather than chasing valuations?
As I said, apart from having a sound product which is monetizable, corporate governance is extremely key in building a company, right? So there has to be that focus. I think it is important and imperative that founders, sometimes as I said, they're all technocrats. Probably they don't have enough experience. Some of them are doing their first venture or second venture, right? So I think it's important we educate them. They need to have at every stage, and you have to have minimal or appropriate requisite corporate governance standards in relation to your size, what business you are in, what are the regulations that you are governed by. And the most important thing, I think the big lacuna is that as companies grow and evolve, they reach that ultimate stage, which is a mature or pre-IPO, but they have not kept in tandem with their corporate governance requirements. And so in the end, they're really trying to scramble to meet the really stringent requirements that a company which needs to IPO, etc., needs to. So I think the most important thing is for companies through the journey, they need to have periodic interventions, and that can only happen through the board, through various committees, through external engagement, to ensure that they keep abreast of the corporate governance requirements as they grow. and reach that mature pre-IPO stage where the requirements are stringent, and then if they have not kept pace, then there is a huge lacuna, and there's always a struggle to meet those standards.
I wanted to ask you, what is your assessment of the current governance framework that has been stipulated or mandated in law? Are
Right.
they appropriate enough to tackle the requirements of a startup ecosystem and the nature of regulations that you require these startups to conform? Are they in tune with the times? What is your take on that?
Right. So I think that in India, at least, I think there has been a lot which has been done to strengthen corporate governance for companies, right? Right from the Companies Act 2013 amendment, it has made mandatory appointment of independent directors, establishment of audit committees, disclosure, extended or enhanced disclosure requirements, etc. Right? SEBI regulations also are now very stringent, including the corporate governance code. They are trying, they have prescriptions relating to board composition, disclosure, related parties, risk management, CSR, etc. There is IBC, and there's a lot of regulatory enforcement happening by the MCA, SEBI, RBI. The regulators also not only are doing this individually, but are doing this in tandem, right? So I think there is a fair amount of regulatory oversight which is there. Again, when it's a smaller company, I think or the companies at a seed or a seed level or at an evolving level, I think the focus is not too much. But given that these people have taken external capital, right, it is incumbent upon them to have those minimum standards of having a minimum board composition. There has to be some basic compliance monitoring, a finance function, external audit, etc. Right? So even at the earliest stage, you have to have some minimum standards which are prescribed by the law, and it is incumbent upon all the board members, the investors, to ensure that these are being that these minimum standards are there and are being properly, properly maintained in those companies, as they go through their journey.
In your view, who do you think should do the heavy lifting to ensure better governance outcomes for Indian startup ecosystem? Should it be the government or the regulator or the boards of these startups or the founders?
So as I earlier said, corporate governance is a collective and a shared responsibility. It cannot be done by one person alone. It has to be done in tandem with all stakeholders. I think from a governance perspective, they have done a lot. There's various schemes like Startup India initiative, which has helped promote the startup ecosystem. There's the Samrit scheme, which helps to enhance the accelerator ecosystem, right? I already talked to you about what are the regulations the government has come. Now, it is then incumbent upon the promoters or the founders and the investors, the financiers, and all stakeholders, minority shareholders, to make sure that these standards, which are prescriptive in nature, so I don't think these are binding at an early stage, but these are enforced in some shape or form, because ultimately all of this is going to lead to better value, better transparency, better governance and oversight, and ultimately it will only help the company in its journey, right? Better conflict resolution. From all perspectives, it's a collective responsibility, it's shared, and everybody needs to come together to ensure that corporate governance standards are maintained and upheld in corporate India and in startups.
Okay. So as one former SEBI chairman recommended, do you think Indian startup should be put through the paces of regulatory mandate of conforming to the requirements of listed companies 1 or 2 years before they prepare themselves to get listed, so that you ensure better governance standards in these entities?
Right. I don't want to comment on the statement that the former person you alluded to, but in my personal view, absolutely yes. that I don't think, I mean, putting through the paces is a strong term, but absolutely any company, as I told you, a startup which goes through its maturity and has reached the maturity phase or a pre-IPO phase, anyway, it doesn't, IPO just doesn't happen the moment somebody says, I want to IPO, lo and behold, there's a long journey. So there is a process where even if a company today wants to, IPO, it takes a year to 18 months by the time they can go through that. So I think at that point in time, and even before, they need to review that, are they really ready? Because in a mature company, you need to have various frameworks as part of your corporate governance. So my belief is it should be prescriptive. It shouldn't be, enforced, because again, there is a lot of trade-off between resources, capital allocation, etc. But definitely, in any IPO process, there are a lot of checks and balances. You have a lot of auditors vetting the documents, vetting the disclosures, etc. So I think that is anyway a check and balance, but it should be prescriptive in nature. And everybody is seeing India as a great attractive destination. Startups is the way to go. I think that now the ecosystem is very clear that there has to be certain standards, and as they are prescriptive, they will be enforced largely, by and large. That's my view.
So what does that entail? Just as we have auditing standards and accounting standards, is there a case for governance standards for startups?
Yes, absolutely correct. There is a case. And as I told you, we had released, through consultation with all stakeholders, we've come up with, we believe, the first of a kind. Even the G20, I believe, they came up with some minimum requirements, right, for startups. And I think we can build, and whether these documents are relevant, I think all participants we spoke to, be it founders, be it eminent people in corporate India, be it investors, they were all very clear that this is something which is required. And, we need to educate. The process of education, building certain consensus, and then coming up with some of these prescriptive guidelines, I think this is key, right? As these accelerators are constituted very early in the DNA of a company, as they are, in the seed stage or the very early stage, they need to be taught about the fact that only, product market fit is one thing, but as you go through a journey, there are various other important things like corporate governance, which is only going to, if done correctly, will enhance value. So I think these are the things we need to do, put in place, and already there are efforts, there are initiatives, but yes, lots more needs to be done to ensure that we don't have such issues which we've seen in the past.
But the startup ecosystem is booming in India, and
yes,
we have more than a lakh registered startups, right?
Yes.
So from your end, has there been any exercise or attempt to assess the governance standards with a wider sample of startups?
Yes, so as I said, from our end, I can talk to you from a Deloitte perspective. Like last year in June, as I said, we came up with this study, which Deloitte was the knowledge partner, along with IVCA and IICA, so which is the Indian Institute of Corporate Affairs and the Indian Venture Corporate Association, right? Or we made up a startup. I mean, we came out with a startup governance playbook. We believe it's the first of a kind playbook in the world, not only in India, but we may be wrong there. But in this, we have actually taken a 360-degree feedback from all stakeholders, right? As I said, be it investors, be it promoters, founders, be it key people in the regulators. We've gone and spoken to a wide variety of people, and we have come up with a playbook. It's a prescriptive in nature. So today, any founder, depending on which stage his or her company is at, they can look at it and see what are some minimum guidelines. And again, it's not like this is the gospel truth, but at least it helps people embrace what they should be doing. It helps educate people. And I think, as I said, the G20 also came up with some guidelines. I think various forums are there which need to, build on this, or they can come up with, because it's pretty standardized, right? It's not, but yes, you will need to chop and change depending on which industry you're in, which sector the startup is in, but it's something which is important. The other thing is, you need to attract good talent. You need to be able to make sure that you have a corporate governance team. You need to have the ecosystem, hire those people upfront, have the right independent directors in place. right advisors in place, which will help you get to that level. So yes, this is something which we have done, and it's being built upon, by a lot of other stakeholders.
I want you to help me understand what do you think is the assessment of global VCs and other investors on the startup ecosystem? There is a perception that the image has taken a dent in the wake of few incidents from a few bad apples in the Indian scene. So, do you share that perception, or that perception is behind us?
Well, definitely, some of these incidents happened. We cannot, ignore that, and these came to light. But I think, and some of these were large, right? So they did catch the attention, right? And I can tell you, in our experience, what we saw that there was a lot of, as you know, that the funding has reduced over the past year. They call it the funding winter, though a lot of investors have a different perspective. But what's really happened with overseas investors is they have adopted a bit of a cautious attitude, but they never stopped investing. So when I say cautious attitude, they looked at a lot of additional diligence. Right, they made sure that their teams or their advisors put in place certain, corporate governance. Made sure that if they invested, what was the current state assessment of corporate governance? What should be the state? And they put in place those measures even pre-investment, or put it as a CP post-investment. Right. So, and the diligence process was enhanced, right, and so on. So I think definitely there was cognizance that these issues were happening, and there was also cognizance that you need to fix them. And that's what they did, is my experience.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. So, do you think that caution or the so-called funding winter arose because of governance issues, or there were other extraneous reasons to those caution on funding?
Well, I think it was a bit of a mix, but definitely you cannot solely attribute it to the issues. I think, the time for cheap capital, it just coincided with the time where abundant capital was over. And I think the big focus and the big shift for all investors is in unit economics. Everybody today, you speak to anyone in the ecosystem, people are very clear that there has to be a path to unit economic profitability. Right? Obviously, it will not be there upfront, but the time for freebies, as they say, is over. So I think that was another very, very key and an important point, because of which, the funding reduced. Having said that, and answering your earlier question, I believe that the worst is behind us. A lot of the VCs we speak to and we interact with say that they are here, they are ready to deploy, they have dry powder, and they're willing to, and they're already doing that. So it's not like something which they will do. They already started reinvesting back in the ecosystem, but they obviously want companies which, they've learned from the past. So they want to make sure they have taken into account those issues and they'll solve for them. There will be more periodic interventions. There'll be better and more robust diligence. But at the same time, they're looking at re-looking at India, because they believe this is the one bright spot in the global economy.
Indian government has taken various steps to strengthen corporate governance practices in the country. Now, how adequate are these, and what more can the government do to raise the bar on this front?
Right. No, absolutely. I think the government has done a fair bit. As recently, now for the listed companies, etc., you have to report within 48 hours of anything which can materially impact your operations, even a rumor, right? So I think those are very stringent kind of guidelines, and those. I can say that it's not easy to comply, but at the same time, the government is trying to do a lot. What more can the government do? I think the biggest thing the government can do is to do a lot more education. My personal view is that, startup founders, there are a lot of seminars where people are going to VCs to understand how they invest, what are the requisites for how companies will grow through the journey, But I think there has to be a lot more education by the various regulators, by people like us, by corporations like IVCA, etc., on educating founders on, there is life beyond the product. There is, for a company, it's not only the product, but many other things kick in as you kind of establish product maturity, monetization, etc. So I think the education is a key thing. There also has to be more enforcement, I feel, and there has been a lot of enforcement. But I think enforcement and where possible, bringing to light those examples, penalties, what are the inspections, etc. Bringing to light those, showcasing those corporates where there have been issues. I think that can also be done a little bit more stringently by the government. So that's my view on, what can happen more in terms of the governance perspective.
Okay, and you also feel that there has to be a sort of preparation 1 year before the IPO, so that
Yes.
Startups are in a good frame of mind on the governance side.
Absolutely. And I don't even think it should be 1 year. I think as the companies reach maturity, because even from the time they reach maturity to IPO, there could be 3-4 years or 2-3 years. From that very point in time, they need to adopt those various things that a mature company, which is equal to a company which is listed, right? And it should have those that culture. It should have those various committees. It should have proper internal, external audit, fully functioning board, etc. Right, so that it can, be on the path to full compliance as they reach the IPO stage.
So, who, according to you, can be good forum to enforce it or oversee such compliance?
I think all the bodies, the corporate bodies, the investor bodies, regulators, I think these are the people on whom it's incumbent to, ensure that there is enough education, there is enforcement, right? I think it's on these people on whom the burden lies.
Great. So my last question to you, Mr. Nikhil, is that again, there is a perception, I may be wrong here, that women-founded and women-run startups have better governance to their credit. And is that perception a fair one? What is your take on that?
I mean, I think there's a lot of study which needs to be done as far as this is concerned. But my personal view and reading from a few surveys that I've seen, right, and just to quote a few, the MSCI ESG report, it said that companies with strong female leadership, they give a double-digit return as opposed to a single-digit return for those which are not led by women, right? Similarly, there was a study in Fortune 1000 companies between 2002 and 2014, which said that women-led companies showed a remarkable 200% plus return. So I think, well, I have not studied these, but these are some reports out there. Having said that, there is a recent study called Women in India Startup Ecosystem Report, WISER, in short. And this has clearly stated that, Indian women-led startups are achieving a lot of diversity, much in advance of the men-led startups or where women are not playing a key role. I think this is something which is very, very clear. They have demonstrated much, much higher number of women in leadership roles. There's a lot of diversity and there's a lot of mentorship. How this has happened is through mentorship, right? And that's what something which I can look into, right? And because it's very difficult, they have really nurtured women leaders through all stages because and ensured that the gender gap has reduced. So I think from that perspective, women-led companies, I think, are definitely there, and it's much better. We've seen in our own personal experience that it's important to have diversity in decision making, different perspectives, and it's really imperative to have women leaders in startups and in all functions in any company, corporate, etc. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to mentor and lead the women, mentor and nurture women leaders of the future.
Great. So if I can squeeze one more as a parting thought, what do you have to say about governance practices in other jurisdictions as regards startups, and how do you think India is faring when compared to the developed world?
Right. So I think, as I mentioned, that in different jurisdictions there are different regulations. Right. U.S. They are more. It's a rules-based approach. So there is, for example, Sarbanes-Oxley, the SEC rules governing public companies. These are very stringent, right? And sometimes they can be overly prescriptive, burdensome.
So, do you also advocate a rules based approach rather than a principle based one that we seem to be following now?
Yeah, so I'm just coming to that, right? So in other jurisdictions like UK, etc., it's more principle based. But I think the ideal mix is the ideal thing is a bit of a mix, right? And I think we have a good there's lots more which can be done, right? But I think a mix between a principles and a rules based approach, I think that is where there is flexibility for the company to evolve and grow, given they are the best judge of resources, investments, people, etc. But at the same time, it should be a mix of the two, and that will really, I think, lead to largely a winning formula in India.
But what is the current approach that we are on now?
I also believe that there is, as far as the startups is concerned, it's largely principles based. But as they kind of grow into more mature IPO companies, it becomes rule based, which is prescribed as per law. So I think it's a good mix, but there could be a little bit more rules based at the smaller size companies. But at the same time, we shouldn't stifle innovation. The big challenge there, Srivats, is can there has to be a balance between the whole thing about the startup ecosystem is innovation. You have to give them room to develop and grow. So you have to prescribe few rules, but at the same time not stifle innovation, right, of the founders. So I think that's really the balance one needs to.
So, sum and substance, the message you want to leave me with is that there is a need to move the needle on the rules front for mature startups. Is that what?
For some of the smaller size companies, right? And because the mature size startups, as they go to IPO, they will have to make those compliances prior to listing.
So what you are recommending is that there may be a case for a more rule-based approach for small-sized startups.
Yes, but at the same time, maintaining a balance between risk and innovation.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
that is always there. So what all this amounts to, that we shouldn't go the path of an SRO towards startup governance.
So we should, as I said, there has to be some minimum prescriptive rules, but at the same time, it has to be self-regulated, right? Because for the smaller companies, it's going to be very difficult to provide a full rules-based approach, because I think that will kill or stifle innovation. It will stifle the ability. But as you grow, right, you anyway have a proper at a mature stage, you anyway have a large, a proper rule book for a pre-IPO company. You have the corporate governance standards, you have LODR listing guidelines, etc., right? So that's my recommendation. There has to be self-governance at the early stages, and that's the responsibility of the collective stakeholders, as I said. But there could be a bit more rules that we can do for the smaller and the mid-sized companies.
Great. Got that. So thank you so much, Nikhil, for your perspectives around startup governance. And it was a great conversation this morning. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.